The dining room of Auberge Lumière smelled the way money always does. Expensive flowers, warm bread, and something just slightly sterile underneath, like a hospital that had learned to dress well. Vivienne Calloway had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon. It was now 11 minutes past 9, and the party at table 7 had ordered a 3rd bottle of Burgundy without once making eye contact with her. She didn't mind. Eye contact meant conversation, and conversation with this particular table meant enduring the particular brand of performative wit that men like Harrison Blackwell seemed to believe was their God-given contribution to any room they entered. Blackwell had arrived at 6:30. Vivienne had known exactly who he was before the maitre even whispered his name. You couldn't spend 3 years in Toronto's financial pages, even reluctantly, without learning to recognize the face of Blackwell Capital's founder. 6 made in the way that men who inherited significant social capital described themselves as self-made. He had the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told in any room that mattered that he was wrong. She'd watched him dismiss the sommelier's first recommendation with a flick of his wrist. She'd watched him send back the amuse bouche without tasting it. She'd watched him interrupt his own dinner guests, 2 younger men in suits that cost more than Vivienne's monthly rent, no fewer than 4 times in the first 40 minutes. And she had kept her face perfectly, professionally neutral throughout all of it, the way her mother had once told her to keep your hands still in a storm. Not because it changes the weather, but because it saves your energy for when the storm passes. Her mother hadn't said much lately. The stroke had taken most of her words in February. Vivienne set the 3rd bottle down with care, angled the label toward Blackwell's eyeline as she'd been trained, and waited. He didn't look up. "There's a film on this glass," he said. She looked at the glass. There was no film. The stemware at Auberge Lumière was run through a separate rinse cycle, inspected individually, polished by hand before service. She had polished that glass herself 40 minutes ago. "I do apologize, Mr. Blackwell. I'll bring you a fresh one immediately." She brought a fresh glass. He accepted it without acknowledgement. The younger of his 2 guests, a man she'd heard called Rémy at some point, though she wasn't certain if that was his name or simply something Blackwell called him, caught her eye as she stepped back from the table. He looked almost embarrassed, almost. She'd learned to read that look too, the almost embarrassed look of men who witnessed unkindness and chose, for professional reasons, to look away. The night moved the way nights at Auberge Lumière always moved, in careful, choreographed intervals. Appetizers, a pause, entrees, another pause filled with the ambient string quartet and the barber and the particular several times a week, and still Huandin, and still felt they deserved it. Vivienne moved between tables with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 6 years making her body invisible in rooms that weren't designed to notice her. She checked in on a couple celebrating what appeared to be an anniversary. She refreshed water at the corner booth, where a woman sat alone with a novel and a glass of Sancerre, and who tipped, Vivienne had learned over several visits, with extraordinary generosity and absolutely no fuss. She noted that table 4 needed their bread basket replenished. She was carrying that bread basket back toward table 4 when she heard it. Blackwell's voice, lowered but not lowered enough, the voice of a man who had never truly had to worry about being overheard. Ancilla mensa, non intelligit nisi mensum ipsam. The table servant understands nothing beyond the table itself. Latin. She felt it land somewhere between her shoulder blades, precise and deliberate as a thrown stone. She kept walking. Her face didn't move. The younger guest, Rémy, laughed, the short, uncomfortable laugh of someone who wasn't entirely sure what had just been said, but knew enough to know it wasn't kind. Fluent? the other man asked. God, no, Blackwell said, back to his regular volume now, easy and expansive. Not the help. Vivienne set the bread basket down at table 4 with steady hands. She smiled at the couple there. She asked if they were enjoying everything. They were. She walked back toward the service corridor and stood for a moment behind the partition where the lighting was fluorescent and harsh, and no one could see her face. She breathed in once. Out once. Her first year at the University of Toronto, she had placed out of the Latin requirement entirely on the basis of a placement exam. Her professor, a dry and precise woman named Dr. Achibi, had looked at her test results over the rims of her reading glasses and said, "Miss Calloway, when's the last time you actually had to try at something?" That was 9 years ago. Before her mother's first diagnosis, before the scholarship funding, restructuring, before the choice that hadn't felt like a choice at all, before Vivienne had sat in a hospital waiting room, calculating exactly how many credit hours she'd need to drop to cover the gap between her mother's benefits and the actual cost of her care. She had tried after, had planned to return. Life has a particular talent for making plans feel like optimism dressed up as strategy. She straightened her apron. She picked up a clean linen cloth. She walked back out to the dining room. Blackwell's party was well into their entrees when she returned to check on them. The burgundy was down by a third. The younger men were engaged in a conversation about a development project in Calgary. Something about waterfront property and rezoning, and Blackwell was holding court the way he always seemed to hold court. Leaning back, speaking in incomplete sentences that others rushed to finish for him, making his confidence felt in the room like a shift in barometric pressure. He glanced up as she approached. "Another bottle," he said. Not to her, exactly. More at her the way you speak at furniture when you're deciding whether to rearrange it. Of course, the same burgundy, or... Same. He'd already looked away. She nodded and turned to go. Although, his voice stopped her. She turned back. He was studying her with the particular expression of a man who had just decided to entertain himself. "Tell me, what do you actually know about wine? Or is it all just?" He gestured vaguely at the room, at her, at the general concept of her existence in this space, memorization. The two younger men went very still. This was the thing about cruelty in rooms like this. It arrived without announcement. One moment the evening was moving along its appointed course, and then a man decided he was bored, and the temperature changed, and suddenly everyone at the table was waiting to see what happened next. Vivienne looked at him. She thought, for a fraction of a second, about the professional answer. "We have an excellent selection, Mr. Blackwell. I'd be happy to consult with our sommelier." And the answer that kept the evening on its track, that kept her job exactly where it was, that allowed him to return to his conversation, feeling vaguely satisfied that he'd confirmed something about the natural order of things. She thought about her mother, and the way her mother's hands had looked on the hospital blanket, very still. "No longer speaking," she said. "The 2017 has exceptional structure, but if you're finding the tannins a bit assertive for the second half of the meal, we have a 2019 that's considerably more integrated. Warm harvest, lower elevation fruit. It's more forgiving on the palate without sacrificing the complexity you seem to prefer." Blackwell blinked. It was a small thing, that blink. Involuntary. He covered it immediately with a half-smile that was meant to read as amused and landed slightly to the left of that. "Is that so?" he said. "The 2017 is technically the stronger vintage." Vivienne continued, in the same even, informational tone she used when describing specials. "But technically stronger isn't always contextually appropriate. It depends on what you're actually after." The younger man, Rémi, made a sound that was almost a laugh. He stopped himself. Blackwell picked up his wine glass and took a slow sip, set it down. He was recalibrating. She could see it, the way a man recalibrates when the room has shifted around him without his permission. "I'll stay with the 2017, he said. "Of course." She brought the bottle. She opened it at the table with practiced efficiency. She poured. She left. The quartet finished a movement of something French and started something else. The couple at the anniversary table were sharing a dessert now. The woman with the novel had ordered a second glass. Vivienne worked the rest of her section with the same deliberate quietness she always carried, and she did not let herself think about the conversation at table 7 again until much later, when she was in the staff room changing out of her work shoes and the shift was over and the exhaustion had settled into her feet like ballast. She was pulling on her coat when the maitre d', a composed and fastidious man named Philippe Lebrun, who had worked at Auberge Lumière for 11 years and trusted very little and noticed everything, appeared in the doorway. "Vivienne," he said. A moment. Her first thought was that she was about to be reprimanded. She ran through the evening quickly, the way you run through a film, looking for the frame where everything went wrong. The wine conversation. She'd been too direct, stepped outside the acceptable radius of interaction. She prepared herself for the version of this she'd heard before, in different rooms, from different managers. "We need you to be more careful about tone. Our guests expect a certain kind of experience." "Philippe?" She looked a stand. "Mr. like to speak with you. Before he leaves, he'd like to speak with you before he leaves. He's in the front lounge." He left her with that, and she stood in the staff room for a moment with her coat half on, calculating the particular geometry of a situation she didn't yet understand. The front lounge of Auberge Lumière was where the restaurant kept its good armchairs and its most strategic lighting. It was a room designed for certain kinds of conversations, deals that didn't need to be written down yet, apologies that required witnesses, or the quiet culmination of evenings that had taken unexpected turns. Blackwell was there alone. His guests had gone. He was holding a glass of the middle distance with the expression of a man running a calculation. He looked up when she came in. Something in his face had changed. Still composed, but the particular performance of dominance had quieted slightly, the way a room quiets after a door closes. "Sit," he said. She sat. She kept her coat on. He looked at her for a moment, with something that might, in better light, have been respect, or at least its approximation. "That was an interesting answer earlier," he said. "Thank you. I didn't mean it as a compliment." "I know," she said. He turned his glass once in his hand. "You have a background in something. You're not just service industry." It wasn't a question, but she treated it like one because it gave her more control over the answer. "I studied at the University of Toronto," she said, "classics with a concentration in ancient languages. I left before completing my degree." She paused. "Family circumstances." He watched her with the sharp, assessing attention of a man who built his reputation. She had the strange sensation of being measured against a standard she hadn't been told about. "Classics," he repeated, "among other things." He set his glass down, not aggressive, just direct. "I said something earlier. At the table. In Latin." "I know," she said. The silence that followed had texture to it. You understood every word. Another silence. Longer this time. He had the particular look of a man reassessing, and reassessment was not a posture that came naturally to him. You could see the effort of it in the slight tension at the corners of his mouth, the way his hands stilled on the arms of the chair. Harrison Blackwell had made his fortune on the confidence of first assessments. He did not enjoy finding out that a first assessment had been wrong. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. He said it the way people say things they've decided to say rather than things they feel. Not without sincerity, exactly, but with the controlled quality of a decision rather than an emotion. "You don't have to," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I do owe it." She looked at him. She thought about her mother. She thought about Doctor, she and her reading glasses. She thought about 9 years of plans and the particular weight of choices that are made for you while you're looking the other way. Qui alios despicit, saipsum despicit. She said it quietly, without heat. The one who holds others in contempt ultimately holds himself there too. Blackwell was very still for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not the performed laugh she'd heard at the dinner table, something smaller, more involuntary. "Juvenal," he said. "Seneca, approximate paraphrase." She paused, but close. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't quite locate. Not embarrassment exactly, more like the particular discomfort of a man who was intelligent enough to recognize the mirror when it was held up to him and who did not entirely like what it reflected. "You work here full-time?" he asked. "4 nights a week. I work at the university library the other days." "And the degree?" She met his eyes without difficulty. "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly, picked up his glass. "My company has a corporate archive," he said. "Historical documents, correspondence going back to the firm's founding. We've been trying to find someone who can properly catalogue and contextualize it. The founding partners had a taste for correspondence in French and Latin. We've had 3 archivists come through in 18 months. None of them could handle the primary sources." She said nothing. "It's not charity," he said, reading her face accurately. "It's a job that needs doing, and I've been unable to find someone who can do it. You would be compensated at a professional rate. It would be part-time to start, which I understand would allow you to continue your other commitments." The string quartet had stopped for the night. The restaurant was very quiet around them, the particular quiet of a place that had spent an evening being full of people and was now in the process of becoming itself again. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because Ancilla Mensa understands considerably more than the table," he said. The Latin was deliberate, precise. He was quoting himself back at himself, which she recognized as a form of self-correction that cost him something. She considered him for a moment. She had learned, over 6 years of carrying other people's plates and filling other people's glasses, to read the difference between a man who was performing goodwill and a man who was attempting it. It was a fine distinction, and not always reliable, but it was the best tool available. "I'll need a formal job description," she said, "and I'll need to see the archive before I commit, to assess the scope." "Reasonable," he said, "and I'll keep my shifts here until I've decided whether the work is actually what you're describing." "Also reasonable. And," she said, "I'd like it in writing that the position is contingent on the work and not on anything else." He looked at her for a moment with that recalibrating expression again, and she held his gaze without flinching, and something in the room settled. "Of course," he said. She stood, adjusting her coat. "I'll think about it." She walked out through the front lounge and through the dining room, past the tables that were now stripped and reset for tomorrow, past the chairs that were already stacked in the corner near the kitchen, past the bar where a single light still burned over the row of bottles lined up like a quiet congregation. Philippe was at the host stand with a clipboard, running through the next day's reservations. He glanced up as she passed. "Good night?" he asked, in the neutral way he always asked it, meaning only. Did anything require his attention? She thought about the evening, about the glass that had no film on it, about Latin spoken like a weapon in a room full of people who didn't notice, about a man sitting alone in a good armchair, putting his glass down and saying, I owe you an apology with the careful deliberateness of someone learning a new grammar. Better than expected, she said. She pushed through the front door into the November air, and the city was cold and wide and entirely indifferent, the way cities always are, and she stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed the kind of breathing you do when you've been holding yourself very carefully in one shape for a very long time, and have finally, for just a moment, permission to expand. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, a message from the overnight nurse at Sunnybrook, who sent a short update every evening. Quiet night. Your mum was awake for a little while around 7. She asked for you. Vivienne read it twice. Put the phone away. Started walking. The street was lit amber from the sodium lamps, the kind of light that makes everything look older than it is. A little softer, a little more like something that will eventually matter. She passed a woman walking a dog that was far too large for the neighborhood. She passed a bakery that had already started its overnight bread. She passed a streetcar stop where a man in a transit uniform was reading something on his phone with the complete absorption of someone who had found, in that moment, exactly the thing he needed. She thought about what she would tell her mother when her mother's words came back, and she still believed they would come back because that was the kind of belief you couldn't afford to give up. She'd tell her about the Latin. She'd tell her about the Latin. About the look on Blackwell's face when he realized. About standing in the front lounge in her coat and not moving when he tried to arrange the room around himself. She'd tell her. The grammar of respect is like any other grammar. Once you know it, you can hear exactly when someone gets it wrong. Her mother had been a high school teacher for 31 years. She had corrected grammar in a way that was somehow never unkind, had a way of marking errors not as failures, but as the ordinary ongoing work of learning to say what you mean. Vivienne had grown up believing, because of her, that precision was a form of kindness. That knowing the right word for a thing, the exact right word, was one of the ways you honored it. She had not been able to finish her degree. She had set it down the way you set down something heavy when you need your hands for something else, and it was still sitting where she'd left it, waiting without judgment. But she had not stopped knowing what she knew, and she had not stopped believing, even on the long shifts, even in the fluorescent light of the staff room at 1:45, that it would one day matter to someone in a room that could do something about it. November in Toronto had a particular quality, not quite cruel, not quite kind, just honest in the way of seasons that have nothing left to prove. The trees were already stripped. The lake, somewhere to the south, was doing whatever Lake Ontario does in November, which is mostly to remind you that it was there long before the city and will be there long after. She turned the corner toward the subway. She thought about archives, about founding partners who wrote their correspondence in French and Latin, about the particular pleasure of a primary source, the way a handwritten letter or a ledger from 100 years ago carries, if you know how to read it, not just information but temperature, the temperature of the room where it was written, the urgency or the calm, the things the writer thought they were saying, and the things they were actually saying underneath. She knew how to read that. She had always known how to read that. The subway station opened its mouth below her, warm and bright, and she went down into it, and the train came and she sat with her hands in her lap and her reflection in the dark window across from her, and she looked, for the first time in a long time, like someone who was thinking about what came next.